Let's take a look at how we can add color to our vector art. The primary way to do it is with the Paint Bucket tool here. The Paint Bucket tool in Harmony works a little different than in other programs. So let's go through some of its features. I'm going to select a color from our palette. So as you might expect, if you click inside an open area, it will fill it in with paint. But you also have the ability to make a selection and fill several areas at once. However, the Paint Bucket has also colored the lines that we had in there. Let's undo that. If we want to paint just the transparent area, we can come over here to our tool properties and select Paint Unpainted. You can also get to this through the menu over here as well. With this selected, it's only going to paint the transparent areas. So I could select just a few squares or the whole thing. Now let's say on this other grid, we want to replace the color in the filled in squares. Well, there are a couple ways we might go about it. First, we can select the repaint option for our Paint Bucket tool. What this will do is only paint in the areas where there's already a color. But you can see again, it affected our line work as well. Let's undo. If we wanted to make it not affect our line work, what we could do is come into our palette, select the color that that line work is made of, right-click and hit Protect Color. Since the Respect Protected Colors option is checked in our tool properties, the Paint Bucket tool is not going to affect that protected color. So I just select our red again, and there we go. The last of the options we have in this drop-down list here is Unpaint. This basically makes the Paint Bucket tool an eraser. So if I click on an area, it's going to erase what's been painted there. And likewise, if I make a selection, it's going to unpaint all the paint that was filled in those squares. Let's see what other options we have here. This first option has a very specific use case related to images that have been imported and vectorized using the grayscale texture style. That's not something I recommend doing in the first place. When we were importing images before, I recommended you not use that setting, so I'm not even going to bother with this. The next option here applies your inking to multiple drawings. So let's take a look at an example of that. So here I have an animation of this rectangle rocking back and forth. You can see there's several drawings here that make up the animation. So if I'm going to color them, I want to color as many as I can at the same time. So to do that, I'm going to turn on Apply to Multiple Drawings for my Paint Bucket. Now I'm also going to turn on onion skinning. We haven't looked at this yet, but it lets you see multiple drawings at once. Then I'm going to expand this to see even more. So if you look closely, you can see some faint green lines here and some darker green lines here. Those are all the drawings. So if I were to click up here, it would only fill in this one rectangle because the point I clicked doesn't overlap any of the other drawings. Also, you'll notice it turned off my Apply to Multiple Drawing settings. That'll happen after each action you take. So I'm going to turn that back on, and this time I'm going to try it down here. And there we have it. It looks like it got all of them. There we go. Since the base was overlapping, the single click affected all the drawings. I'm going to undo that to show you something else. Now I'm turning onion skinning back on. Just like with our checkerboard example, I could also go to Paint Unpainted, turn on Apply to Multiple Drawings, and then draw a selection around them all. And that would also color them all in. If your drawings didn't have a point where they were overlapping, that's what you would have to do. This next option is similar. Apply to Visible Drawings. This means it's going to apply your Paint Bucket fill across multiple layers instead of multiple drawings. So here I've got a circle on one layer and another on another layer. So if I enable this option, even if I have Circle 2 selected, I'm able to fill in the drawing on Circle 1. You can see again, this option turns off after each action you take with it. And also, if these circles were overlapping, like the drawings, and I turn this option on again, I would be able to fill both at the same time. Or even if they aren't overlapping, and I have this option enabled, I can just circle around everything, and it will fill in both. Though again, in this case, I probably want to do paint unpainted. There we go. We've already talked about respect protected color before. But our next option is that same use stored color gradient feature from our paint tool. In this case, let's say we had a gradient and we want to use it as a fill. So by default, the gradient gets scaled to each area that it fills. But let's say we didn't want to do that. Let's say we filled this top bar and then using the selection tool, selected it, chose this option again to store the color gradient. Then when we use our paint bucket tool, this option is enabled. And if we turn that on, now when we fill in our squares, it applies the gradient the same way it did when we stored it in the top drawing. This last option in this row is a little weird. If you enable this, it will make a selection out of whatever the last thing you filled is. So you can see here there's an orange selection line around that. I don't really know what that's meant to be for, but if you need it, that will let you do it. That's it for these options. But while you're here, I wanted to remind you of another way to handle colors. If you go to your selection tool, remember you have this option to select by color. So now if I click on this blue area, it's going to select all of the areas that have that same color. From there, if I wanted to change it, I could just come here and select another color from the palette. So that might be a better way to handle some situations instead of the paint bucket tool. Now, as anyone who's done line work can tell you, you don't always get it perfect. Sometimes there are little gaps left in the line work that will mess up your paint bucket tool. For example, if I come in here and try to color this character's hair, it's not working. It's probably because there's this little bitty gap here, or there might be a gap somewhere else. Rather than hunt around for every tiny gap like that, you can use this option in your tools property. You have an option for close small gap, close medium gap, or close large gap. And you can specify an exact pixel value right here if you want. I think close small gap should do it. There we go. Now let's say that gap were even bigger. Let's say even too big for a large gap to close. Now we could put a line there, but if we didn't want to, we could come into our Paint Bucket submenu and choose the Close Gap option. And then we just click between the points. It's giving us a warning that we're drawing an invisible stroke which we won't be able to see. But if we hit K to turn on our vector strokes, now we can see it. So the Close Gap tool will always draw a straight line between your points that you specify. If you want to draw an irregular line, you can use the Stroke tool. There. Let's turn off our strokes for a second. The other thing the Stroke tool is good for is dividing up an area that you don't want to divide with a line. So let's say we were going to put a highlight in her hair. We could turn our strokes back on, and then come in here with our stroke drawing tool, and just draw a pattern where the highlight will go. Then we can come in with a lighter color, and fill in that area. Now let's say we wanted to give her hair a colored outline instead of this black one. We could use the Paint Bucket tool, but there's another tool specifically for coloring penciled lines. It's right here called the Ink tool. So let's look at how our Ink tool works. First of all, let's pick a darker brown to use for this outline. So first of all, if we look at our Tools property, if we enable this option, Show Inkable Lines, it will highlight all the pencil lines in our drawing that this tool will work on. We probably want to have that turned off most of the time. This next option is just called Be Smart on Connecting Lines. That's pretty vague, but you probably want it on. It will help you make smoother selections when you're trying to select multiple lines at the same time. This next one, Use Selection Mode instead of Hover Mode, is one you probably want to leave off. Hover Mode is pretty cool. When you bring the ink tool over a line that it can color, it's going to highlight it for you. So to use this tool, you would just click and drag and it's going to find all the lines that you're going over. And when you let go, it's going to fill it in. Now you can see we missed a few spots here and this one here. So that's the main thrust of using the ink tool. There are a couple other options, however. There's this tool again that will make whatever line you last painted a selection. Again, I'm not sure what that's for, but it's there if you need it. This other option that's on by default is bring ink lines on top or under. If you have overlapping lines, you can see the last stroke I made is on top. But if I use the ink bottle tool to change the color of the one underneath, it's going to now put that on top. If I have this option off, it's going to leave it underneath. So that might be important when you have lines overlapping lines of different colors. These last options here are our miter and our endpoint options again. These options really only affect lines drawn with the line tool or the shape tools, not ones that have been drawn with pressure sensitivity. If you have two of these lines that are almost perpendicular, and let's say we set our joint to bevel, now if we use our ink bottle tool to color these some other color, it's going to change that corner point to beveled. If we have it as miter, it's going to change it to a miter joint. It's probably best just to leave this as is for now. There's one more drawing feature you might want to know about. Some people prefer to do their inking with the brush tool rather than the pencil tool because it gives a greater control over the line weight. However, later on, if you want your lines to be different colors, it might make it hard to distinguish one line from another if they're all the same color fill. Here I've inked this character again using the brush tool. If we select everything, we can come up to Drawing and create breaking triangles. What this is going to do, it's going to look through the drawing and try to detect spots where it thinks one line might be butting up against another. So now if we use the Repaint tool, we can come through and you'll notice it's making a distinction between this line for the hair and the line for the ear. Before, it might have treated this all as one fill and tried to fill everything in this one color. Finally, let's talk about the right way to use our art layers so that we can have separate line art and color art. So here I have the elf drawing we imported earlier. What I want to do is transfer all the strokes from the line art layer to the color art layer so that I can use the paint bucket tool on that layer and leave my line art alone on the line art layer. So basically, all you need to do is select everything, or hit Command A to select everything on the stage, and then either in your selection tool operations, click Create Color Art from Line Art, or you can do the same thing up here on this toolbar. So let's just click one of those, and that should work. Now let's go to the Drawing tab so we can see better. We're going to switch to the Color Art layer, and we can see we've got a bunch of strokes there. Now if we turn this option on, we can see both at the same time. If you don't want all this line art getting in the way, you can come back to the camera view, and there you'll be able to have the color layer selected without seeing the strokes, unless of course you hit K to enable it. So now if I use the paint bucket tool and start filling in areas, if I go back to the drawing view and go to solo mode, you can see that the color is getting put on this layer and our line art is just as it was on this layer. If this process seems like more hassle than it's worth, then feel free to work on a single layer. Lots of people do. If you ever decide to jump to Harmony Premium and get into the nodal compositing system, the art layers have some more usefulness there. That's it for our vector coloring tools. Next, we're going to dig deeper into the color palette.